Thanks so much, Steve, and welcome to everyone who's on me as well. I'd like to join you today from the land where you people. UNSW is located on the lands of the Aboriginal people, and I'd like to pay respect to elders past and present from those lands, as well as all the other lands that you're joining us from today, and extend my own warm welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are here with us. So I'm going to try and share my screen, which you can hopefully see there. And what I thought I'd do today is try to really just take you through some elements of my own career journey that will hopefully be of some interest and value to some people, at least here today, and may offer some about why I've chosen the clinician research path, and hopefully might inspire and help some people to do the same. So the first thing I think to say is I feel incredibly lucky to be in such a rich and rewarding career. I think there's no career like it. There's no time for boredom. The wonderful balance between immediate rewards from clinical patient care that I'm fortunate enough to still be able to do, balanced with the much longer term, often spanning very many years, projects that can make a real impact to health more broadly. And the incredible people I get to work with as part of that, with an opportunity to make a real difference. I feel very fortunate, and I encourage all of those colleagues online to consider this sort of pathway. I think it's also important to note that I had no idea where my journey was going to take me or the path that it would take. And to quote the famous Donald Rumsfeld, there was just so many unknown unknowns for me. I came from a humble background. I was the first in my family to go to university. I went into medicine thinking I'd just get my degree and get out and start working in clinical practice, and that would be it. During my internship and hospital, early hospital roles, I learned that I really did enjoy hospital care and specialist care, and that was probably the area for me. So I went down that path. I ended up in nephrology because they offered me a job first out of nephrology and respiratory medicine, which were the two areas that I had sort of enjoyed. And I loved it. And I thrived and really enjoyed my clinical work. And then I got to my end of my training and had to figure out what to do next. And I'd been working quite intensely on the wards, as all JMOs and registrars do. And after 6 or 7 odd years of continuous ward work, I decided I needed a break. And so I thought, what better way to take a break than to do a PhD? So what a mistake that was, thinking that was a break. It certainly wasn't. It was different and busy and challenging. But the main challenge was learning to work in a different way, which was critical. Rather than having an immediate task list that you just deal with, taking a much longer term view and thinking about how to, in different ways, how to achieve goals, and working at it over a long period of time required an entire change in attitude from me. And it taught me about research, which I hadn't understood. My PhD was a mix of lab and clinical work, and the other valuable thing was that it taught me I was no good at lab research. This is again one of those key lessons. As you go through, you will not only learn the things that you're good at, but also the things perhaps that are not for you. And that was certainly the case for me. In contrast, I started to really enjoy the clinical studies, and I was fortunate enough to work in a department that encouraged and supported me. But the local department didn't have real expertise in the area that I was interested in, which were randomized controlled trials. Just as an illustration, my first randomized trial, which I designed as part of my PhD and implemented locally in ways that make me shudder at the moment, needed me to randomize patients. And so I went and spoke to others in the department and asked how do I organize randomization? And there was no one there who could really help me immediately. And I had a patient coming in that day. So I randomized my first patient to a clinical trial by flipping a coin, literally. And that was important for me because it taught me the power and the importance of allocation concealment, because when I flipped the coin, the patient who I randomized went into the group that I would have preferred him not to go into, and there was an incredibly powerful temptation just to flip that coin again, and highlighted some of the challenges that we face in randomized trials if they're not done to the highest quality. So I learned that I really loved that area, and my department head at the time sent me off to be the local site investigator for an international clinical trial. And that trial was called the SHARP trial. This was a large trial of lipid lowering in people with chronic kidney disease. And my PhD was focused on elements of cardiovascular disease in people with kidney disease. So this fit in well. And I went along and listened to the presentations about this trial. And suddenly I knew for the first time really in my life that this was what I really wanted to do. Up until that time, I'd really just gone with the flow, just followed opportunities as they arose and done things that seemed like a good idea at the time. But when I saw and learned about this trial and what it was doing, it became obvious to me that this was where I wanted to spend my time and my career. So I went and spoke to the person running the SHARP trial from the George Institute at the time, who's become a good friend of mine now, Bruce Neal, and talked to him about coming up to Sydney from Melbourne, where I was originally based, to spend some time learning about clinical trials. And we agreed I would come up for 6 months in the first instance. And I did, and I loved it, and discovered really not only a passion that I didn't know I had, but I really discovered the truth of this statement by Confucius, because every day was fun and interesting and enjoyable, and certainly didn't feel like work. So that was a turning point for me. I spent my 6 months at the George in Sydney, and then went back to Melbourne to take up a good clinical role. I was being groomed for some senior roles in the department there. I had a young family, 3 children under the age of 6. I had, established social and work networks. I was comfortable, but having tasted the sort of trials that I learned I had a passion for, I just wasn't happy. And at the first opportunity, about a year later, I returned to the George Institute in Sydney, and I took a big leap. I took a cut in pay. I did drag my family up here. We had no social supports or networks. We moved my eldest son out of school. We made a whole range of different changes, and it was difficult. It was really difficult. But work was incredible and enjoyable. The family really started to enjoy it. There's a bit of background noise here, sorry. I'm not sure what that is. I'll continue. So I got established at the George. The family got very quickly established, and soon loved being in Sydney. And I started to try and establish myself, and it turned out to be much more difficult than I had thought. Over the first 2 or 3 years, it was really hard to get any publications. It was hard to get involved in important studies. It was hard to get funding. It was hard to get things up and running. And after about 3 years, I wondered if I'd made a big mistake, and maybe it was time to go back to clinical work. It really didn't seem to be working. And I thought, in the words of Homer Simpson, I'd tried and I'd failed, and maybe that was my mistake. But just when I thought that maybe I should return, things really started to kick off. I got involved in some new important studies. A number of papers that I've been working on for a long time got published. After submitting 8 fellowship applications in 1 year, one of them came through, and suddenly I was funded for a few years, and things started to take off. And it really started to feel like I had truly felt and found my destiny. And again, the one time in my life that I've really felt that sense was around the work that I've done in clinical trials, which was fantastic. But it was not easy, and there are so many people working in the area, and so many people who I've had the privilege of working with over the years who are just so brilliant. And it's wonderful to always be surrounded by people who are smarter than you, but it's also a challenge. And again, over time, learning to work with these people, having the opportunity to mix both locally, nationally, and internationally with some of the most incredible people in the field was an incredibly valuable thing for me and helped to really push me and drive me to do bigger and better things. I also learned to work with mentors and learned to take advantage of some of those people and literally, not literally, but figuratively stand on their shoulders to help me do more. And things, again, started to take off. Particularly once I learned that I needed to also rely on the people around me a bit more and build a team. And once I started to recognize that it was okay if my team were better at things than I was, again, the team really started to take off. So I've been very fortunate. I've had the opportunity to work in some of the most interesting times, I think, in researching kidney disease. And one of the big opportunities that I've had is choosing to take on one of the biggest problems. This is data from the US. There's similar data from around the world showing the failure, I think, of all of us in nephrology to address the challenges faced by our patients. This shows you that in 1980, there were about 70,000 people with kidney failure requiring dialysis in the US. By the mid 2010s, that was up to over 700,000 and is now well over 800,000. In contrast, for example, to the dramatic reductions of 60 or 70% in the risk of cardiovascular death and adverse cardiovascular outcomes that's been achieved over that time. So another key learning for me was you've got to take on the big problems if you want to have an impact. And if you take on the big problems, you're more likely to get funded and you're more likely to actually achieve something. So that's what we did. And sometimes you can do that in relatively simple ways. This was a paper that we published in the Lancet in 2015, where we just decided to count up the number of people receiving renal replacement therapy, dialysis or transplantation around the world with kidney failure. And then we built a model and did some projections out to 2030. And this has been incredibly important, having been cited over 1,000 times now, but also influential in helping show that there was a real need and a real challenge for us. It also identified that fewer than half of the people with kidney failure around the world actually received dialysis, which has helped lead to innovation in the area of kidney failure. So from simple things, just counting up the number of people on dialysis, we're able to actually have a substantial impact. A lot of my research now has been focused on the prognosis of people with kidney failure and kidney disease, even at earlier stages. And people with kidney failure have some of the worst survival rates of any condition. Here's a figure that compares dialysis patients to various cancers, showing that you're better off being diagnosed with colorectal cancer or kidney cancer or many types of lymphoma than you are with being diagnosed with kidney failure if you want to live for 5 years on average. And we've been trying to take this on. Much of my early work was focused on doing systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and getting involved in randomized trials, looking at interventions that might help reduce this risk. And it's just a summary of several trials and meta-analyses that we had the opportunity to report, showing here that in early kidney disease, you could make a difference because the benefits appear to be similar, but in advanced kidney disease, and particularly in people on dialysis, it was really hard to make any difference. So again, here in what we had the opportunity to then do was to say, well, perhaps the key thing here is not to try and treat people once they've reached dialysis, but rather to prevent them from reaching end-stage kidney disease again. And here again, I had an opportunity I could take advantage of. At the George, they were running a glucose-lowering trial called Advance, a large 11,000-person international trial. And I had the opportunity to look at the renal outcome data, and there was a suggestion that intensive glucose control might prevent kidney failure, but the data was really very weak. There were very few events, and it was hard to know whether this was real or whether it was a chance finding, but at the very least, it supported the need to do more research into glucose-lowering trials. And really, this opportunistic analysis has kicked off what's been the most productive part of my career so far, in allowing me then to shop that around. And I took that data to pharmaceutical companies around the world who were developing new glucose-lowering drugs in order to encourage them to do trials in people with diabetes, looking at whether we could prevent kidney failure. And those trials had never been done. And I was able to convince one company here, Boehringer Ingelheim, who were developing a DPP-4 inhibitor, linagliptin, to include a renal outcome in one of their major studies. Unfortunately, it didn't work. We found no effect of this drug on kidney failure or related outcomes in people with diabetes, which was discouraging. But the value of not having just a single iron in the fire became apparent, because I'd also had the privilege of being involved in a trial called Canvas, which was looking at an SGLT2 inhibitor. And in this trial, we found a significant reduction in proteinuria with the drug, which was much more than would be expected based on the trials of glucose lowering. And that led to a major renal outcome study called Credence, which I had the privilege of leading. After many years, it took me more than a decade of trying to convince people to run a trial like this, to get it up and running. And we published this over the last couple of years, and it's had a very big impact, being cited over 2,000 times to date. And this has led to a whole series of new trials subsequently, which highlight, I think, the value of having multiple trials on the go at a time. And some of those new trials are now looking at additional glucose lowering agents. This is a GLP-1 inhibitor trial that I'm now leading. Also have had the opportunity to lead trials in other areas. And again, highlighting the value of running multiple things in parallel and trying to really build a portfolio of research activities. Another area that I've worked is in the area of IgA nephropathy, and we've been running a trial called the TEST, which has taken us 10 years to complete. We've actually just locked the data on this trial, but we had to stop it in 2015 because there was an excess of serious adverse events identified by the Data Safety Monitoring Committee. And this, at the time, was a disaster for us. Two of these patients with IgA nephropathy died as a result of infective complications of the steroid treatment that we were testing. And so we're able to redesign that and be transparent, be clear, but redesign the study to now test a lower dose, and we'll be reporting that later this year. So I thought I'd found my niche with all of these trials. I had the privilege of running the George Institute. It was great. And I was the director of the George Institute for about 8 years. But by the end of that 8-year period, I noticed myself becoming stale. And I think that's another sort of key message, is the need to reinvent yourself regularly and to look for new opportunities that can help you grow and develop further. And subsequently, I was fortunate enough to be appointed to the role of Dean at UNSW, Medicine and Health, after being contacted by the Vice Chancellor. And I loved it, not because I love bureaucratic work, because there's plenty of that, not because I have educational experience, because I don't, although I recognise its importance, but because of, again, the opportunity to make a difference. And I've taken that role and I've loved it, and really enjoying the pathway and the process, and the opportunity to work with incredible people to do good things. So that's my journey today. I've learned a lot over the time. I continue to learn as we go. I encourage you to do the same. I would never give up the life that I've had and the opportunities that I've had, and I'm incredibly grateful for it, although I could never have predicted it. And I think the key message I'd give you is just be open to opportunities, because they'll come, and if you identify the ones that work for you, you can have an incredibly rewarding career. And the combination of clinical work and the ability to do important science and get involved in leadership I think is the best of all worlds, and I feel very fortunate. So on that note, Steve, I'll hand back to you.